Picture your town cut off, roads blocked, shelves emptying, and no truck getting through for longer than anyone can promise you. At first, it's just an inconvenience. You ration what's in the pantry, you make the coffee last, you tell the kids it's an adventure. But say it keeps going. Say it goes on for weeks, and then for months. Eventually a much colder question shows up, one most of us never expect to actually have to answer out loud.
If there isn't enough food left for everyone, who gets to decide who still eats?
Almost 700 years ago, in a French port town called Calais, that question wasn't a thought experiment. For 11 straight months, an English army camped outside the walls, waiting for exactly that question to break the town open from the inside. And twice, the people running out of food behind those walls had to answer it, by choosing who to send out through the gates, and gambling everything on whether the army outside would show them any mercy at all. Calais, in the summer of 1346, was not a grand city. It was a working port on the narrowest stretch of water between France and England, its streets built around a harbor, a fish market, and a reputation its neighbors up and down the channel knew well and mostly feared. For as long as anyone in the town could remember, Calais ships had made a second living raiding English merchant vessels whenever the opportunity came up. Roughly 7,000 or 8,000 people called it home. Fishermen, sailors, dockworkers, and the trades that kept a working harbor running, including, in one house near the town wall, a ropemaker who had spent 30 years twisting hemp fiber into the cordage that every ship in that harbor depended on to sail at all. He lived there with his wife, their teenage son, old enough to help haul coils of finished rope down to the docks, not yet old enough that his mother had stopped worrying every time he went, and his own elderly mother, who had moved into their house 2 winters back after her husband died, and the room she'd lived in her whole life stopped making sense to keep alone. Word reached Calais before the English army did. Sometime after the English king, Edward III, crushed a much larger French force at a place called Crecy at the end of August, riders came through with the news, and then, not long after, with a worse piece of news. The English weren't marching home to their ships. They were marching toward Calais. The town had walls and a garrison, and a harbor still theoretically open to the sea. Reasons enough, at first, not to panic. Sieges happened. Most didn't last. A town held out for a few weeks, terms got negotiated, and life picked back up. That was the shape of the thing the ropemaker's family expected. In the first days of September, when English banners started appearing on the marshy ground beyond the walls, and the town's gates swung shut for what everyone assumed would be a matter of weeks. Nobody in Calais, that first week, was rationing anything. There was no reason to yet. The harbor still had fish in it. The granaries were full from the summer's trade. The ropemaker kept working his hemp the same as always, because ships still needed rope, siege or no siege, and a man's hands don't stop knowing their trade just because an army has shown up outside the wall. Calais' reputation for piracy was not exaggerated for effect. For years before the siege, ships based there had preyed on English shipping in the Channel, and capturing the town outright, rather than just defeating it and moving on, mattered to Edward III for exactly that reason. A permanently loyal English foothold, right across the narrowest stretch of water separating the two kingdoms. The town itself held somewhere around 7,000 to 8,000 people before the siege began, small by the standards of a capital city, but a real working port, built almost entirely around fishing, shipping, and the trades, like ropemaking, that kept both of those industries running. The order came from the town's own commander, a battle-hardened knight named Jean de Vienne, less than 2 weeks into the siege. Calais had a garrison to feed as well as its ordinary people, and de Vienne had already done the arithmetic every commander in his position eventually does. The stores that could feed a smaller number of mouths for a long time could not feed everyone in the town for anywhere near as long. So an order went out, and it fell hardest on exactly the people least able to argue with it. The old, the very young, the sick, anyone who couldn't fight and couldn't work a trade the siege still needed. Somewhere close to 1,700 of them, all told, were told to gather what they could carry and leave. The ropemaker's family watched a neighbor go, an old dockhand who'd worked the same stretch of harbor as the ropemaker for 20 years, a man with no trade left in him anymore and no family inside the walls to argue for keeping him. He joined a slow column of people moving out through the town gates on foot, carrying whatever bundle of belongings fit under one arm, walking directly toward an army that had just beaten France's own king in open battle 3 weeks before. Nobody in that column, and nobody watching from the walls, knew for certain what would happen next. An army that had just crushed the flower of French knighthood at Crécy owed a column of Calais old and sick nothing at all, not safe passage, not food, not even the mercy of a quick death instead of a slow one. The ropemaker's mother stood at the wall with the rest of the family and watched the column go, and said, quietly, that she was glad it hadn't been her turn yet, and glad, in the same breath, that it might not have to be. What happened next surprised most of the town. Word came back within the day. Edward III had let them pass. More than that, his men had fed the column a hot meal and sent every single person on their way with a small handful of coins, 2 pence each, more mercy than anyone inside Calais had dared to expect from a king they'd spent years raiding at sea. For one evening, the mood inside the walls lifted. If this was how the English intended to fight this siege, maybe 11 months from now nobody would remember it as anything worse than an inconvenience. That first expulsion and Edward's response to it comes down to us mainly through one chronicler, Jean Lubel, writing roughly a decade afterward. He put the number of people sent out at around 1,700, and credited Edward with feeding them and paying each of them 2 pence before letting them pass through his lines, a detail that survives through one storyteller's account rather than an official record, worth remembering as the siege drags on. By the time the leaves turned that autumn, it was clear the English were not planning on going anywhere. Instead of a camp, they built a town. English carpenters and laborers threw up an entire second settlement on the marshy ground outside Calais' walls, timber structure by timber structure, until it had streets, a marketplace, stables, even a small chapel, a wooden city built from nothing to house an army that would, before the siege ended, swell past 30,000 people. They called it Villeneuve-la-Hardie, the bold new town. From the walls of Calais, at dusk, the ropemaker's son could see its lights. He could smell, some evenings when the wind came from the right direction, meat cooking on outdoor fires in quantities nobody left inside Calais' walls could any longer imagine affording. Men coming back from patrol duty near the English lines told stories, half in disbelief, of a market inside Villeneuve stocked, as well as any market in a peaceful French town. Cloth, meat, fresh bread, supplied by a fleet of English ships that kept the crossing to England busier, some weeks, than the roads into Calais had ever been in peacetime. Inside the walls, the winter told a different story. The harbor's fish stopped being enough by the new year, not because the sea ran dry, but because there were too many mouths and too few boats still willing to risk English patrols to fill them. The ropemaker's wife started stretching the grain with anything that would hold a loaf together. Meat became memory before meat became metaphor. The ropemaker kept working. Ships inside the harbor still needed maintaining, siege or not, but he worked hungrier every week that passed, his hands a little slower around the same hemp fiber they'd known for 30 years. What made it harder to bear, his wife said once, quietly, to no one in particular, wasn't only the hunger. It was watching an entire second town rise up out of nothing just beyond the walls, warm and fed, and getting bigger every month, built for the sole purpose of making sure Calais never got to be either. Villeneuve-la-Hardie was real, and it was not a small camp. By some accounts, its population, soldiers, merchants, and camp followers together, eventually rivaled the English army's own peak strength of over 30,000. Men who visited it that winter reportedly compared its market favorably to major French trading towns, an entire functioning city, built from scratch, for the sole purpose of starving out one much smaller than itself. For months, French supply ships still occasionally slipped past the English fleet and into Calais harbor. One convoy alone brought in over 1,000 tons of stores in the spring of 1347. Then, in late April, English forces captured a fort called Risebank, guarding the harbor mouth, and sealed it. From that point on, nothing. Reached Calais by sea again. By June of 1347, there was nothing left to stretch. The horses went first, not only the town's working animals, but the garrison's own war horses, the kind of animal a knight measured his status by, butchered for meat, because a living horse eating grain no one had to spare was a luxury nobody in Calais could still afford. After the horses came the dogs. After the dogs, by every account that survives, came the cats, and after the cats, whatever else still moved. The ropemaker's mother, by then, had started quietly setting aside part of her own share at every meal, sliding it across to her grandson when she thought no one else was watching. Nobody in the house was fooled, and nobody stopped her, because there was no version of that argument anyone had the strength left to win. Jean de Vienne, the town's commander, wrote to King Philip on the 25th of June. He told his king, in plain terms, that there was nothing left inside Calais to eat, that the garrison had gone through the horses, the dogs, and by then likely the cats as well, and that unless real help arrived soon, the town would be left choosing between surrender and things far worse than surrender. The letter never reached its intended reader in secret. English soldiers intercepted the courier carrying it, and Edward III read the commander's own words describing his town's collapse, before Philip ever did, then sent it on to the French king anyway, so that he would know exactly how close to the edge his garrison already stood. Inside the walls, none of that correspondence changed anything for the people living through it. The ropemaker's family ate what could still be found and pretended, for the boy's sake more than anyone else's, that it counted as enough. His grandmother's hands, wrapped tight around whatever was left on her plate at the end of each meal, had started to shake, not from cold, though the house was cold too, but from a body that had simply stopped being given what it needed to keep steady. Nobody said the word starving out loud in that house. Nobody needed to. Jean de Vienne's letter of the 25th of June, 1347, survives in substance through the chroniclers who recorded it, describing a town that had already eaten its horses, dogs, and cats, and warning that starvation itself, not the English army, was now the real threat closing in. English forces intercepted it before it reached King Philip, and Edward reportedly forwarded it on once he'd read it himself. By July, the garrison gave the same order it had given the autumn before: clear the town of everyone who couldn't fight and couldn't work, because there was, by then, almost nothing left to divide among anyone at all. This time around 500 people were told to leave: children, old men and women, the sick, anyone whose presence inside the walls no longer bought the town anything but one more empty mouth at a table that had nothing left to put on it. This time, the ropemaker's mother did not wait to be chosen. She told her son and his wife, in the flat, unarguable voice she'd used to end every disagreement in that house for 30 years, that she was going, and that the food she'd stop eating would keep her grandson alive a little longer than he would otherwise last. She reminded them, too, because everyone in Calais remembered it by then, that the last time this happened, back in September, the English king had shown mercy. Fed the column. Paid each of them for their trouble. There was no real reason, she said, to expect anything different this time. But 9 months is a long time for a siege to run, and a long time for patience, on both sides of a wall, to run out along with it. The column of 500 walked out through Calais gates in July the same way the column of 1,700 had walked out in September, carrying what little they had left, expecting, or at least hoping for, the same outcome. This time, no meal was offered. This time, no coin changed hands, and no order came to let them pass through the English lines toward open country and whatever chance of survival lay beyond it. They were held instead in the open ground between Calais' walls and the English camp, not inside the town that no longer had food for them, and not through the army that had no obligation, this time, to take them in. The ropemaker's family stood at the wall the way they had in September, watching, waiting for the same news to come back. It didn't come. Days passed. What word did filter back into the town was confused, incomplete, and impossible to fully confirm from inside walls that could no longer send anyone out to check. Only that conditions in that strip of open ground were as bad as anything the siege had produced so far, and that not everyone sent out that July would live to see whatever came next. The family never learned, with any certainty, exactly what became of the ropemaker's mother after that morning. They knew only that she had gone, that the same mercy shown in September did not, this time, repeat itself in full, and that not knowing, in the end, was its own particular kind of weight to carry. Historians don't fully agree on what happened to the roughly 500 people sent out of Calais that July. Some accounts, including one influential chronicler's, describe Edward showing the same mercy he had the previous autumn. Others describe a harder outcome. The group refused passage, left to survive or starve in the open ground between the armies.
Which version is true?
Even now, historians working from the same handful of surviving chronicles don't fully agree. What's certain is that the two expulsions, months apart, are remembered very differently. The first as a rare act of chivalry in a brutal war, the second as a much darker illustration of exactly what a long siege can grind a person down into deciding. For 11 months, the promise that had kept Calais fighting was the idea that King Philip would eventually come. A king did not simply let a major port fall to an English army without answering for it. That was the assumption underneath everything. The reason a starving town kept finding reasons to hold out one more week, and then another. In the last days of July, the promise finally arrived. A French army, tens of thousands strong, appeared on the high ground within sight of Calais' walls, close enough that people on the ramparts could make out banners, campfires, the unmistakable shape of an army large enough to actually break a siege. For the first time in months, something like hope moved through the town. It lasted about a week. The ground between the French army and Calais was a maze of marsh and tidal channel, and English fortifications covered every crossing point worth using. Philip's commanders studied the position for days and came back with the same answer every time. There was no way through that didn't mean throwing thousands of men into ground built, almost perfectly, to kill them before they ever reached the walls. On the first night of August, without ever giving battle, the French army broke camp in the dark and marched away. From inside Calais, the garrison watched the fires of an army that had come to save them go out, one by one, and not come back. There was no confusion about what it meant. The king had come as far as the ground would let him, looked at what it would cost to go further, and decided the town wasn't worth the price. Within hours of the French withdrawal, signals went up along Calais' walls that the town was finished fighting. The ropemaker's family, still short one member none of them had heard from since July, watched those distant fires die out from the same stretch of wall where they'd watched two columns of their neighbors walk out through the gates. There was very little left, by that point, to feel about it beyond a kind of exhausted, hollowed-out relief that the waiting, at least, was finally about to end. The French relief army that arrived in late July 1347 numbered somewhere between 15 and 20,000 men, a real force, large enough in theory to challenge the siege. But the marshy ground around Calais, combined with English fortifications built up over 11 months, made a direct assault look close to suicidal. After about a week observing the position, the French army withdrew without fighting. Calais surrendered in the first days of August 1347, 11 months, almost to the week, after English banners first appeared on the marsh outside its walls. But Edward III, by every account that survives, did not intend to simply accept the town's surrender and move on. Calais' ships had spent years raiding English shipping before the siege ever began, and 11 months of resistance, however understandable from the losing side, had cost him money, time, and men he had not expected to spend. He wanted the town to understand, in a way it would remember, exactly what that resistance had cost. His terms, delivered through intermediaries, were specific. 6 of the town's leading citizens were to come out to him personally, barefoot, dressed only in their shirts, with rope nooses already around their necks. carrying the keys to the town and its castle between them. What Edward intended to do with 6 men delivered to him that way, nobody inside Calais needed to have spelled out. A wealthy townsman named Eustache de Saint-Pierre volunteered. First, stepping forward, by the account that survives, before anyone else in the room had fully finished absorbing what was being asked. 5 more men followed him: Jean d'Air, Jacques and Pierre de Wissant, Jean de Fines, and Andrew d'Andres, until 6 were standing together, ready to walk out of the gates that had kept them alive for 11 months, and hand themselves over to a king they had every reason to expect would execute them within the hour. They walked the short distance from Calais' gates to Edward's camp, knelt in front of the king who now held their town, and offered him the keys. According to the chronicler who later told the story, Edward meant to have them killed on the spot, as an example, and was talked out of it only when his own pregnant queen, Philippa of Hainaut, knelt in front of him in turn and begged for their lives, arguing that killing 6 men who had already surrendered themselves so willingly would bring nothing but bad luck to the child she was carrying. Edward, reportedly, gave in with visible reluctance. All 6 men lived. Whether that exact scene, the queen on her knees, the king's grudging mercy, happened precisely as later chroniclers described it is something historians still debate. The writer most responsible for the story wasn't in the room, and no English record of the moment mentions Philippa's role at all. What isn't in doubt is that 6 men from Calais did walk out that day prepared to die for their town, and that all 6 of them walked away alive. The story of the 6 Burghers of Calais comes down to us mainly through the chronicler Jean Froissart, writing after the fact rather than as an eyewitness, which is why historians treat the Queen's dramatic intervention as a powerful story rather than a confirmed fact. What's better documented is the outcome. 6 named men, Eustache de Saint-Pierre among them, offered their lives to save their town, and all 6 survived the surrender of Calais. The ropemaker's family survived the surrender, thinner, quieter, missing one voice around their table that none of them had stopped listening for. What came next was its own kind of ending. Edward III had not fought for 11 months just to hand Calais back to the people who had held it against him. Over the following months, most of the town's French population was ordered out, given what little time and mercy the king chose to allow, and English families began arriving to take their place. Merchants, tradesmen, settlers building new lives inside walls that had just finished starving out the people who built them. Whether the ropemaker's family was permitted to stay, forced out along with their neighbors, or chose to leave a town that no longer felt entirely like their own, no record answers that question, for a family that never had a name recorded to begin with. What the records do answer is what became of Calais itself. Within 3 months, English settlers were already living inside its walls. Within a generation, it was, in every practical sense, an English town on the wrong side of the Channel, a foothold that would stay in English hands for more than 200 years, long after the war that won it had ended, long after everyone who lived through that particular summer of 1347 was gone. The ropemaker, if he was still working hemp fiber into cordage a year later, would have been doing it for new customers, in a harbor that answered to a different flag than the one it had flown the summer the siege began. Somewhere in that same stretch of years, a grandmother who might or might not have survived a July morning in the mud outside the walls stopped being anyone's specific memory and became, instead, one name among roughly 500 that history never fully accounted for. Edward III expelled most of Calais' surviving French population after the surrender and resettled the town with English colonists. Within 3 months, around 200 English residents were already living there. Calais remained English territory, often called the Pale of Calais, for more than 200 years, until French forces finally recaptured it in 1558. The 6 men who walked out to Edward III are still remembered today. In 1889, the sculptor Auguste Rodin cast them in bronze, 6 life-sized figures, ropes around their necks, walking toward a fate they expected to be final. Copies of that statue now stand in Calais itself, and in cities around the world, including just outside the Houses of Parliament in London. You will probably never have to stand at a wall and watch your neighbors walk out through a gate, not knowing whether the people waiting on the other side will feed them or leave them to die in the mud between two armies. Most of us will never have to answer, in any real way, the question this video opened with. Who gets to eat when there isn't enough left for everyone? But the people of Calais answered it twice, 10 months apart, in front of the same enemy, and got two completely different answers back. The first time, an army that had every reason to be merciless chose, for reasons its own soldiers probably couldn't have explained, to feed a column of strangers and let them walk on toward whatever came next. The second time, exhausted and out of patience on both sides of the wall, it didn't. That's the part of this story worth sitting with longer than the sieges and the surrenders and the 6 men with rope around their necks. How much of who lives and who doesn't, when the food finally runs out, can come down to something as unpredictable and as human as which day it happened to be.